He deleted the app on a Tuesday. No dramatic event triggered it. No fight, no final disappointment, nothing that would make a good story. He opened the app, removed it the way you'd remove something that had stopped being useful, made dinner, watched something he actually wanted to watch, and went to bed at a time that made sense for him. Nobody knew. He didn't announce it. He just stopped. Another man, different city, different life, started leaving his weekends unscheduled. He had places he could go. The issue was that he'd spent 8 months rearranging every Saturday around a woman who treated his availability as a fixed variable and her own as something that could always be renegotiated. He stopped rearranging. He started showing up to things he'd been declining for almost a year. A third man stopped explaining himself when plans changed. He used to send long messages, context, apology, a rescheduled time, a question checking if she was okay with it. Now he sends 2 sentences. He didn't turn cold. He simply ran the same calculation enough times to understand that the long message never once changed how the situation landed, and the energy that went into writing it had never once come back to him in any recognizable form. These men assessed what was being asked of them, looked at what was coming back, and reached a conclusion that required no one else's sign-off to act on. The environment a lot of men are navigating right now is one where the comparison never stops. A man takes a woman on a date, and somewhere in that evening, he's being held up against every curated version of every man she has scrolled past in the last 72 hours. These aren't real men, they're constructed projections. The one posting the vacation, the one with the caption about his business, the one who filmed himself doing something impressive and earned 40,000 likes for it. The man sitting across the table can't compete with a feed. The feed is edited, the man is present, and he starts to feel the gap without being able to name it. He leaves the date unable to tell how it went. He texts the next day and watches the message sit there. He adjusts his energy, his humor, his availability, and the adjustment produces nothing stable. Just a response rate that fluctuates based on factors he has no visibility into and no ability to influence. At some point, something specific happens. He stops adjusting. He ran the same cycle enough times to see that it doesn't produce what he was told it would. So he stops trying to optimize for a structure that wasn't built for him to succeed in. The connections that do form in this landscape have a particular quality. You reach for them and they're there. Warm, real, something you can actually feel. And then you close your hand, and what you're holding isn't quite what you thought. What felt solid turns out to have been responding to the pressure of your attention. The moment your attention becomes a given rather than a variable, the temperature drops. What felt like connection reveals itself as something that needed uncertainty to stay alive. He invested 4 months, consistent, present, genuinely interested, not performing a script, just actually showing up for another person and letting that be visible. She told him near the end that things had gotten too comfortable. That word, comfortable, delivered as a diagnosis of a problem he'd created by being reliable. Another man heard a different version of the same sentence. He was the person she called when something fell apart, the one who showed up, the one who stayed until things stabilized. When the instability resolved, he heard less from her. The conditions that had made him visible, her crisis, were gone. He hadn't become less valuable. He'd become less necessary. A lot of men have lived some version of that. The details change, the shape holds. This is the part that gets misread most often, because the easy read of everything up to here is that this is about women being the problem. That's not what's being described. The men stepping back aren't stepping back from women. They're stepping back from a specific set of conditions that make sustained connection structurally difficult for everyone inside them. Women are living inside those same conditions, shaped by them, often just as frustrated by them. The social architecture that rewards instability and penalizes reliability doesn't spare anyone operating inside it. The men walking away aren't walking away from people. They're walking away from an environment. That distinction matters because it changes what you're actually looking at when you see these men exit, and it changes the question worth asking, which isn't why these men are failing at connection. It's why the structure around connection has made reliability into a liability. One thing the environment does specifically is invert the signal. A man who is genuinely available gets read as having nothing better going on. A man who is inconsistent gets read as having options. What used to communicate reliability now communicates something else entirely. And the man who doesn't know the code has changed, keeps sending the same message without understanding why it isn't landing the way it used to. So he runs diagnostics on himself, his timing, the length of his messages, the speed of his replies, the specific way he phrases interest. He treats himself as the broken variable when the environment is what shifted. And the environment, being invisible, never gets examined, because examining it would require admitting that the problem isn't one he caused and isn't one he can fix by adjusting the inputs. That admission takes time. Some men never reach it. The ones who do tend to stop running diagnostics around the same time they stop adjusting. One man stopped going to places he didn't want to be. He'd been showing up to bars he disliked, events he found hollow, social scenes that drained him, because the consistent advice was that being visible would eventually produce something worth the cost. He stopped going. He put that time into the work he'd been postponing for 2 years. Nobody asked him why he disappeared from those rooms. He didn't explain. Another man arrived at a different version of the same clarity. He'd been making himself legible, easy to read, predictable, comfortable to be around. He assumed that was what was being asked of him. What he eventually understood was that his legibility was useful precisely because it made a less available option feel like a meaningful contrast by comparison. He wasn't being valued for what he brought. He was providing a floor that made the ceiling look higher. There's a version of this that takes time to fully land. Not the concept, but the actual weight of it. A man spends months building something he believes is real, and he's right that it's real for him. What he doesn't account for is that the role he occupies in someone else's life isn't necessarily the role she occupies in his. He is the anchor. She may be present when nothing else is competing for her attention. From the inside, both can feel identical for a while. The men moving out of this aren't moving into isolation. That framing that this represents a generation of men too wounded or too close to connect gets the causality backwards. These men aren't leaving because connection isn't available. They're leaving because they looked honestly at what the available version of connection was actually costing them and decided the math didn't work. What they walked away from, a structure where the rules shift without notice, where demonstrating genuine interest reads as low value, where the effort required to maintain the dynamic flows consistently in one direction. What they moved toward, their own schedule, their own priorities, their own sense of what a day should feel like. That second option isn't a consolation prize. For a growing number of men, it's the better deal, not by default, but on its own terms. What's moving them out isn't damage. That's the second layer underneath all of this, and it matters more than it might seem. It isn't a wound that hasn't healed, or a woman who left too many marks, or a series of rejections that compounded into avoidance. Some men do exit from that place, and when they do, it's visible up close. The preoccupation is still running, the edge in how they talk about it. The energy that proves the thing is still active in the background. The men described here aren't preoccupied. They've genuinely moved their attention somewhere else. The work they'd been postponing, the friendships that had been running on leftover hours, the specific clarity that arrives when you remove a sustained source of volatility from your daily life. They aren't still arguing with what they left. They are somewhere else entirely, and confusing that with bitterness is exactly how this gets misread. A man still inside the dynamic, even just in his head, is still defining himself against it, still letting it set the terms. A man who has genuinely exited has nothing left to argue with. He just lives differently now. In concrete terms, the exit looks like this. He stops front-loading investment into every new interaction. He stops engineering his responses around how he's being perceived. He stops clearing his schedule on the chance that something might develop. He stops reconstructing meaning from silences and small tonal shifts in messages. This doesn't happen through discipline or willpower. At a certain point, the orientation toward those things simply expires. The way interest expires when the return stops arriving. A conclusion reached through repetition rather than a decision made in a single moment. If you've watched this and recognized specific decisions, not abstractly, but in something you actually did last month or last year, then you already know what this is really pointing at. What you did, if you did it, isn't a failure of openness. It isn't a refusal of connection. It's what happens when someone with genuine intelligence and self-awareness runs an honest assessment of what a particular dynamic was actually producing and acts on the result. There's a real difference between a man who is closed and a man who stopped paying a price that was never going to be worth what it cost. One of them is stuck. The other made a call. The men who fully exit tend to find that the infrastructure of their life expands to fill the space, and this is visible and concrete, not a platitude. The hours that went into managing an unstable dynamic get redistributed. Friendships that had been running on fumes get real investment. Work that had been treated as secondary gets moved up. A sense of actual forward motion returns, of getting somewhere rather than repeatedly arriving back at the same emotional starting point. One man in his mid-30s described it as a plain observation, nothing self-help about it. He hadn't cooked a real meal in 14 months. The relationship hadn't just taken his time. It had taken the specific energy he used to put into making his own life feel intentional. The version of himself that shows up when nothing is consuming the bandwidth. 6 weeks after the exit, he was cooking every night, not to signal anything, not as a routine to feel better, because he wanted to, and nothing was in the way. 14 months. The time matters less than what the time cost, and he hadn't ended it dramatically. He had just, quietly, stopped going back. The men who describe this don't frame it as winning. They don't use the language of someone who came out ahead in a contest. They describe getting off a road that was taking them somewhere they hadn't chosen, and walking in a direction that made sense. No ceremony, no declaration, just a different direction. What accumulated to bring them there was rarely a single event, a particular kind of exhaustion, the kind that builds from sustained exposure to the same cycle. The investment that didn't carry, the adjustment that changed nothing, the connection that felt real until the moment it showed its own terms, each instant small enough to move past, the sum decisive. There's a specific version of this that almost didn't make it to the exit, the man who talked himself back in, once, then again, then one more time after that. Each return with a slightly updated explanation for why this time the conditions were different. He could see the pattern from inside it. He went back anyway, because the other side of the exit felt uncertain in a way the familiar difficulty did not. The cycle was at least legible. What came after wasn't yet. That version of the exit took longer. It required one more round than the others. The last one running shorter, its recognizable shape now more exhausting than the uncertainty he'd been avoiding. When it finally arrived, it came the same way all the others had. No final conversation. No clean moment of decision. He just stopped going back. The door stayed closed long enough that closing it stopped being something he had to actively choose. The men who reach that sum, who arrive at the decision through a quiet accounting of what the last year or two actually took from the things they genuinely cared about, those men don't reverse course easily. They found something on the other side of the exit that they hadn't anticipated, a life that moves at a pace they set, toward things they chose, without requiring constant management of someone else's volatility as a condition of its maintenance. That isn't a description of isolation. That's what a man's life feels like when it actually belongs to him. The visible social consequence of all this is a growing number of men who are simply not oriented toward partnership as a primary goal. Not temporarily, not in a gap between relationships, structurally out. They're friendly, functional, often socially engaged. They date occasionally if something genuine presents itself without requiring the full investment cycle. But they have recalibrated what they're building their lives around, and a relationship is no longer the organizing variable. This isn't a movement. There's no shared vocabulary, no group, no coordinated message. Each of these men arrived at the same place through his own accumulation of specific experiences. The convergence isn't designed. It's a natural outcome of a large number of individual conclusions arriving at the same destination from different starting points. The man who deleted the app on a Tuesday doesn't know the man who stopped rearranging his Saturdays. They never crossed paths. They didn't read the same thing or arrive here through the same door. They just looked at what was happening in their own lives with enough clarity to see it and made the same call. That's what happens when a decision holds on its own terms. It doesn't need a community to sustain it. It sustains itself because every day that passes inside the life built on the other side of it confirms that the call was right. Not because the alternative was unbearable, because this one is genuinely better. He still sees her name come up sometimes. A mutual contact, an old message thread, something the algorithm resurfaces for no reason. He doesn't feel much when it happens, not because anything hardened, but because the version of him that was invested in that particular outcome is further back in his timeline than it used to feel. He made dinner that night too, went to bed at a reasonable hour. The apartment was exactly how he left it.